Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you critical discussions with thought leaders in defense, security, and global affairs. My name is Heather Lee, and I, along with Gabriella Picton, will be your hosts for today's episode. The CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. In today's episode, we are joined by Dr. Jessica Trisko Darden, an associate professor of political science at Virginia Commonwealth University and the founding director of the Insecurity Lab, and Dr. Kateryna Busol, a Ukrainian lawyer specializing in international humanitarian and criminal law, and an associate professor at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. In the first part of this episode with Dr. Jessica Trisko Darden, we will be focusing on conflict-related sexual violence, what it is, why it occurs, and what mechanisms we currently have for stopping it. In the second part of this episode with Dr. Kateryna Busol, we focus on how conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine is perpetuated by Russian soldiers and how Ukraine is supporting survivors. This is the Expert Series.
All right. Thank you so much, Jessica, for joining us today. So on the first note, what is conflict-related sexual violence, and why do we differentiate between CRSV and gender-based violence more generally?
This is such an important question. The official UN definition of the term conflict-related sexual violence is 165 words long. So it's a very complex concept, and at its heart is really the idea of any form of sexual violence ranging from rape to forced prostitution to forced marriage or pregnancy committed against men, women, boys, or girls that takes place in the context of ongoing conflict. And it may be deliberately linked to a conflict, directly linked to the conflict in the sense that violent actors, either the state or fighters in that conflict, are actually perpetrating acts of sexual violence, or it may be indirectly linked to a conflict in the sense that the conditions of conflict are enabling this violence to occur. It's really important to differentiate this from gender-based violence more broadly, which can occur both in wartime and peacetime contexts, and that are much more closely associated, for instance, with violence against women, spousal or domestic violence, the intentional murder of girls and women based on gender, a term that's really been prominent in Latin America as feminicidios, as well as violence targeting LGBTQ plus individuals. And so as a result, we have different legal mechanisms that have been developed to address these two forms of violence, and the context in which they occur are quite different.
You hinted at this in the previous question, but now I kind of want to move to the idea of why CRSV occurs. Is it a strategy of war, or does it result from a broader increase towards violent inclination that happens during times of conflict?
I think this is a really important question, and the answer is both. So the scholar Carrie Crawford has written a book on the weapon of war framing of wartime sexual violence and why it gets so much play as a so-called weapon of war. And one argument that she makes is that the international community operates under this militarized framework. So talking about sexual violence as a weapon used in conflict had a lot more salience to traditional security policy thinkers. But it's important to note that it's not solely the case that armed groups use conflict-related sexual violence as a weapon. Conflict also leads to the breakdown of social order, which can create opportunities for profit-making and for abuse that otherwise wouldn't exist. So to give you one example of this, I'm going to turn to the Islamic State group. So in August 2014, 10 years ago, Islamic State group laid siege to the Yazidi community centered around Mount Sinjar in Iraq. 400,000 Yazidis were displaced, 3,000 were killed, and another 6,000 women and girls, as well as young boys, were kidnapped. So that was a direct product of ISIS's military strategy. At the same time, what happened next was directly related to the kind of broader breakdown of social order. So some of these individuals were handed off to fighters as prizes or booty, as has occurred historically for millennia. Others were sold in modern day slave markets. And so there's an economic dimension to that conflict related sexual violence that was perpetrated against the Yazidis as well. So I think it can be both. It can operate as a direct strategy of war, but conflict conditions can also enable opportunistic use of sexual violence.
CRSV is currently designated as a crime against humanity and can be prosecuted under international humanitarian law. And I want to now go more specific on that because just saying it can be dealt with under IHL is not very telling. So what existing mechanisms under IHL or other forms of international law do we have to punish perpetrators of CRSV?
So it's really interesting because international criminal law is an evolving body. We've had several international tribunals that have taken up conflict-related sexual violence and have approached it differently. So, for instance, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which was constituted by the UN after that conflict, did examine wartime sexual violence. And notably, it included cases of sexual violence against men, and it included sexual enslavement and rape as a crime against humanity. And that was really the first time that these specific subcategories of wartime sexual violence were articulated. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which was formed in the wake of the Rwandan genocide, examined specifically rape as a crime of genocide. But it wasn't really until these two conflicts in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda that people were actively thinking about how to prosecute these specific forms of crimes. So in some ways, the international legal framework is driven by on-the-ground developments. The flip side of that is that international criminal law is really designed to focus on the individual. It's been developed in a Western legal framework, which assumes that individual perpetrators commit crimes and individuals face justice for those crimes. And ultimately, prosecutions for wartime rape, for instance, are often based on underlying domestic rape laws, which have been criticized for decades, right, if not more than a century. And legally, rape is either committed through force or the threat of force in a civil law approach, or without consent in a common law approach. And so we've really, we have a variety of mechanisms and forms of the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, these various UN tribunals that I just mentioned. There hasn't been a coherent and dominant legal approach to punishing perpetrators of wartime sexual violence.
I want to then kind of sort of continue with this discussion and ask, what are the limitations of international law as a mechanism in and of itself as deterring and punishing CRSV?
So a lot of the perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence are not bound by international law, right? So non-state actors are increasingly engaging in this behavior, and they're not party to international treaties. There's no mechanism for holding them accountable in states where the central state authority, the government, is fragmented or weak. So if we think about countries like Syria, Yemen, or Somalia, where armed groups can operate freely or with the support of the government, even, the idea that there would be accountability imposed at the state level is really difficult to imagine, right? And so that's why institutions such as the International Criminal Court were created to step in when states are failing to punish individuals for these crimes. However, states have to subject themselves to the authority of the International Criminal Court. And most notably, the United States is not a member, but many other relevant states are also not members. So, for instance, the International Criminal Court determined that it did not have jurisdiction over many of the Islamic State groups' crimes because Syria was not party to the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court. And so, again, international law holds for those who respect international law. And we really see a gap here in terms of where sexual violence, wartime sexual violence is likely to occur. It's already happening in contexts that have kind of rejected many of these international humanitarian norms.
So, given that there is kind of an inadequacy in many respects of international law in dealing with CRSV, what other mechanisms does the international community have to try and reduce its occurrence?
So I think this is one area where civil military relations and in particular ethics training can make an impact, particularly as it relates to wartime sexual violence perpetrated by official military and police forces, right? So non-state armed groups, very little one can do to influence the ethics or operations of those groups, but national militaries, international actors have a lot of influence on. So, for instance, countries who send soldiers to the UN to work as peacekeepers or send their forces to participate in UN police force operations, right? They can be banned from receiving these lucrative contracts from the UN if their individuals engage in sexual violence, and they should be, right? This would create a clear financial incentive for change, since the UN typically provides more funding to the military providing country than those countries pay to their own soldiers, right? So it's a profitable venture for many countries to send UN peacekeepers, and that can be used as leverage over those national militaries to ensure that they make it very clear to their forces that they need to abide by these norms. But there also just needs to be a greater emphasis on sexual violence and mitigating sexual violence within militarized institutions, right? We know, for instance, in the United States and in Canada as well, right? There have been lots of reports indicating extremely high levels of sexual violence within national militaries. So if we can't take it seriously as an issue in our own armed forces, why are we then expecting other countries or other armed actors to take it seriously as well? So I would really start with ethics training and enforcing norms.
Is there a certain degree of impunity that these individuals face when whether or not they are state sanctioned or especially for non-state sanctioned actors, but particularly for state sanctioned actors? Is there a degree of impunity that they have if they commit CRSV, or are there mechanisms that national militaries have to deal with them?
So that's a really excellent question. And I think that it depends on the military. And it also depends on whether it is opportunistic or directed sexual violence, right? So in many ways, directed sexual violence gets ignored in national militaries and becomes a focal point for non-state armed groups. Whereas opportunistic sexual violence, where there's a vulnerable person and the perpetrator is just moved in the moment to engage in those acts, right? That gets written off for non-state armed groups because we have this assumption that, of course, rebels go around raping people. Whereas state-directed sexual violence by national militaries often gets swept under the rug, right? Whether it's happening within the national military or while those forces are deployed. So I think there's a double standard here that cuts differently depending on whether it's a national or non-state armed group. But I do agree that there is certainly a sense of impunity and also a sense of a kind of inequality in the justice that it is brought, right? Because there's also the question of where is responsibility situated? Is it at the level of the individual perpetrator, or is it situated higher up in that command hierarchy, right? And so I do think, to use a very political science term, that permissive conditions matter. Right? If your commander makes it very clear that this behavior is not acceptable and will be punished, studies show that that does have a constraining effect on behavior, whereas we know from, for instance, the Vietnam War, where those norms aren't being imposed, that individuals are much more likely to engage in opportunistic, egregious violence.
Now I'm handing it over to Gabriella and Dr. Kateryna Busol to discuss CRSV in Ukraine.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode of the Expert Series podcast. Since the full-scale invasion in February 2022, how has conflict-related sexual violence been weaponized in the Russo-Ukrainian war?
It's important to know that conflict-related sexual violence has been used by Russia since the very beginning of its aggression against Ukraine in 2014. That happened via the occupation of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula and via direct and proxy armed conflict in eastern Ukraine. And both human rights NGOs, namely the Eastern Ukrainian Center for Civic Initiatives, for instance, or Truth Hounds, and the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, at that time it was a she, Madam Fatou Bensouda, noted in her preliminary examinations report that her office saw the allegations of war crime, of rape and other forms of sexual violence, as well as torture, which, as we will dive further, can constitute also sexual violence, in particularly rape. So I think it's important to first stress that the lack of response, I would say the lack of focus on and response to the emerging atrocities, already horrific. All these crimes were already recorded during the first phase of the war, and because of the lack of attention and because of the lack of response in the escalated full-scale invasion, these crimes have also skyrocketed. They have skyrocketed for a number of reasons. First, because of the culture of impunity in Russia for gender-based violence domestically. There are numerous reports about escalated domestic violence during COVID in every country across the globe, but Russia has been emblematic in actually decriminalizing domestic violence amid COVID and saying that the traditional family does not really experience violence, which of course is not true for any society, including the Russian society. So what such measures have done, they have actually reinforced traditional masculinity and further normalized violence against women and against LGBTQI plus persons. Second, Russia has not been held accountable for atrocity crimes, including sexual violence perpetrated in other contexts, for instance, in Mali, in the Chechen wars, in its aggression against Georgia. And this feeling of impunity, emboldened also by very toxic masculinity across Russian culture and within its military culture, have played out in horrendous sexual violence in Ukraine. And of course, the fact that Russia occupied more territories in Ukraine, essentially, it provided it with bigger texture, with a bigger landscape of perpetrating atrocity crimes, including sexual violence. And I will wind up this introductory assessment by also saying that the fact that dehumanizing rhetoric, which according to my preliminary assessment and that of certain colleagues working on speech crimes, amounts to incitement to genocide, the fact that this dehumanizing rhetoric, in certain cases, allegedly constituting also incitement to genocide, accompanied and is still accompanying the whole campaign against Ukrainians, it emboldens the perpetrators and their commanders further to commit crimes, including sexual violence against persons whom they consider to be not fully human. And this, of course, is, well, greatly disturbing. But I think to get beyond emotions, we should just understand that parallel to documenting, investigating, prosecuting, and repairing harms caused by the physical aspect of sexual violence, we should necessarily also consider the speeches that have enabled, that have supported and fueled atrocity crimes in general, and this type of acutely gendered violence in particular.
Based upon your preliminary assessment, would you say that conflict-related sexual violence is a strategy of Russian total warfare? And if so, how does this change the level of impact it has on Ukraine, Ukrainians?
I would start by saying that atrocities is Russia's means of warfare. The more we look into new analysis, for instance, of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine or the Special Rapporteur on Torture, we see more and more details in their assessment. And I specifically start with the UN mechanisms first, right, because there is such a high methodological threshold that they set for themselves, and such a high threshold of evidence for their conclusions. They indicate that Russia's use of atrocities, in particular torture, is not incidental, and it's not just the manifestation of a certain misconduct, just sporadic misconduct. It's not only widespread among the low levels of the members of the army, but it's also indicative of either ordering or tolerance that is manifested by the particular commanders. The two recent reports by the UN Commission of Inquiry specifically discuss and name and discuss the units of Russia's armed forces and law enforcement brought to Ukraine's occupied territories and teaching the use of torture techniques against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war. So I would say that the use of atrocities, the intimidation of the civilian population, and the attempt to disincentivize the members of the military to continue their military effort by conducting atrocities against them is quite indicative in Russia's behavior. And again, because how acutely intimate, literally and figuratively, how pervasive literally and figuratively sexual violence is, and also how gendered and how indicative of toxic masculinity is both the wider Russian culture and its military culture. I would say that the use of sexual violence has been quite widespread and quite a conscious choice against both Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian prisoners of war, both women and men. This is important to stress that so far it appears that at least 40% of survivors, not only those who decided to come up with their cases and open criminal proceedings, but for instance, those who just submitted their testimony, for instance, for human rights NGOs without the desire to, without the readiness yet to be able to pursue criminal investigation, that the almost half of survivors are males, which again, I think proves how masterminded the use of sexual violence is.
What current challenges would you say exist for ensuring that survivors receive the support and justice that they need?
There are quite a few challenges. First is the representation of survivors' voices. While I've mentioned the exceptional women, for instance, from SEMA Network Ukraine, not all women and not all, especially not all men, are ready to come out and speak about their experience. Among these people, not many identify atrocities perpetrated against them as sexual violence. This is particularly acute with men who would, for instance, discuss the torture they experienced, but wouldn't necessarily decipher the sexual aspects of torture. And it's important that increasingly more and more investigators and prosecutors are trained to identify certain red flags which could signal to them that this particular survivor who describes torture actually has been victimized through something potentially speaking about sexual violence. They require specific support, specific reparation, and unless we know as to what harms have been perpetrated, what harms need to be repaired, we will not be able to provide the nuanced support, however willing we might be. It's important to emphasize both to survivors and to the wider public that there's no hierarchy between international crimes, and we're all unique individuals, and it's very hard to predict how different traumatic experiences might impact us and might play out in the future. So while again it's noble not to try and force not to popularize the victimhood of one's that one has been exposed to, it's important to still discuss this experience and see what support is there, because again, as I emphasize, especially with sexual violence crimes, their impact can manifest itself in the most unexpected mental health and physical health issues in the nearest future or later on. So it's important to still get the treatment. I think there has been less attention so far in Ukraine and less even verbalization of the reproductive violence. But I think it's also because it's essentially the emergent conversation in international law, how reproductive violence is adjacent to sexual violence, but is not always the same. And it's just important to have more training on that, both within the prosecution, within the wider policy makers who work on these issues, and among human rights professionals, because so far human rights NGOs, especially, for instance, they mentioned Yurfem, the Association of Ukrainian Women Lawyers, they still have more trust from survivors. And so it's very important that these so-called first responders, that they know all the layers of harm and could discuss with survivors whether these particular layers are part of their experience, and therefore guide them to the options of available reparations. And last but not least, while, for instance, memorialization or recognition is important, and sexual violence survivors in Ukraine really stress, both before and since the full-scale invasion, that for them, the recognition that this crime has been targeted at them, not just because of certain lust of a perpetrator, but also that this crime was particularly vicious and accompanied by the dehumanizing rhetoric, because a survivor was a Ukrainian and because she or he had a proactive Ukrainian position or was deemed to have such a position by a perpetrator. So survivors say that the recognition of this motive of hatred and then being targeted as members of a national group for them is important. But of course, the wider support, the mental health support, the support with accommodation, the support with relocation is no less important, and it might cost, and most likely it costs more money. So the question about the availability of sources to fund reparations is an acute one. And while now Ukraine on the first is really diligent in recognizing its obligation under international law, that while it's not the perpetrator, right, because the country perpetrator and its agents, perpetrators, are Russia and Russian service persons and their commanders, but while they are currently unwilling to compensate the harm they have caused and are still causing, Ukraine has assumed its international responsibility to step in and provide reparations to survivors. And here it enjoys uniquely, of course, the support of its international partners, including Canada, in funding these reparations. But I think we should still take it one step further and understand that eventually it should be Russia that pays these reparations and that compensates for the funds already provided by Ukraine and its partners in good faith to survivors. So this brings us to the question of freezing and repurposing of Russia's assets, not only for the infrastructural rebuilding of Ukraine, but also for reparations for survivors and for compensating Ukraine and other amazing international partners of our country that have stepped in and support the survivors now while the harms are so particularly acute.
As we come to the end of our questions for today, I'm hoping we can shift our scope a bit more internationally to think about how Canada and other NATO allies can help Ukrainian women and other vulnerable groups better build capacity to combat conflict-related sexual violence. I know you've mentioned repurposing of assets as one potential avenue for international support, but I would be really grateful if you could elaborate on other possibilities and other avenues that might be beneficial.
Well, any practical support on the ground when it's sustained and organized is important. Ukraine, both as a state, as the prosecution and the civil society, are very lucky that in comparison to the initial 7 years of the war, when we had little visibility, let alone support with the documentation, investigation, and really telling the world about the atrocities that Russia is perpetrating. Since the full-scale invasion, the support with the capacity building, technical support has really increased. This has to be, of course, sustained, right? It's not the one-time initiative, and that also has to be conducted with the engagement of Ukrainian partners. There's such a wealth of experience also that Ukrainian professionals can bring, not just, again, being the recipients of trainings, being the recipients of the supports, but the co-shapers of that, right? And also, again, while it might sound perhaps idealistic, but Ukrainian investigators, prosecutors, human rights lawyers could also join, and they do join, the trainings of their peers who work on other conflict situations. And through such engagement, we get a more nuanced understanding how atrocity crimes, including sexual violence, play out in different contexts, how the particular historical, geographical, social particularities of a given context impact our work on the documentation, investigation, and reparation of sexual violence. So this engagement is important. Ukraine also needs more sustained support in amending its criminal legislation. It has been the demand of the, for instance, Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and other partners that Ukraine brings its criminal and criminal procedure legislation in compliance with international law regarding the investigation and prosecution of international crimes, including sexual violence. This process has started recently. You might have heard that Ukraine finally has ratified the Rome Statute, and this will be followed by the overdue amendments to the criminal code. But just to say the least, so far, on the 10th year of Russia's aggression, Ukraine did not criminalize crimes against humanity. Ukraine did not have the full catalog of war crimes and did not have, for instance, the Rome Statute's catalog of war crimes of rape and other forms of sexual violence, right? Which in and of itself was a procedural complication for investigators, prosecutors, and judges to build nuanced cases, and didn't make it easy for them to refer to international jurisprudence on sexual violence crimes. And Ukraine has not had the notion of common responsibility, as we know it under Article 28 of the Rome Statute, when the common responsibility is not about the direct ordering of the crime, but it's also about the failure to prevent or punish it. So these steps domestically need to be made. It's equally important to ensure that Ukraine throughout the country engages women and men equally in investigative work and in its wider engagement with survivors. The specialized unit on CRSV, on conflict-related sexual violence, which was established by Ukraine in mid-2022, does an amazing job by looking at sexual violence committed against women and men, by engaging more female professionals. But it's also the question of capacity, that in the regions closer to occupied areas, in the regions closer to the territories where active hostilities take place, there's sometimes less female professionals. And I'm not saying that female dominance is a response to all issues that we have, but I'm saying that the survivors should have a choice as to the gender of a professional that they prefer to engage with. And that it's actually very interesting. Sometimes actually male survivors prefer to speak with a female investigator or prosecutor. So it's just important to ensure that there is a choice for that in remote areas, in especially rural areas, not only in big cities like Kyiv or Lviv. And finally, yes, I would say that we are approaching this assessment of the urgent interim reparation scheme for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And it's my great hope that we not only expand its scheme to other CRSV survivors, not just the 500 who participated in the pilot, but also to survivors of other crimes such as torture, enforced disappearances, deportation. Crucially, international partners should remember, and the international community should remember, that Russia's aggression started in 2014. So the spectrum of survivors that we are speaking about, the spectrum of survivors who need support, are not only those assaulted since February 2022, but those indeed who have been affected by conflict-related crimes since 2014. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Expert Series podcast. We've discussed the evolution of conflict-related sexual violence, particularly its devastating weaponization by state-backed actors in the Russo-Ukrainian war. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so that you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a review, send us an email at josh@cdainstitute.ca, or reach out to us on social media. Your feedback helps us bring you content that's relevant and engaging. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thank you for listening, and a big thank you to our guests Jessica Trisko Darden and Kateryna Busol for providing their expertise.